Death at Gallows Green, Chapter 35. Novel writers are a devious lot. Just when the question seems resolved and the answers all known, or nearly all, a new difficulty is often introduced, startling the reader out of his complacency and throwing order into chaos once again. Leonore Penmore, Secrets of the Narrative Arts, 1892. Kate was at her roll-top desk in the library shortly after 10 that morning, ostensibly to write the second chapter in Bale Bardwell's The Corpse in the Garden. But even though she was pleased with the plot featuring as it did grain thieves and midnight excursions into the fog-shrouded countryside, she was not making much headway in the writing, for her attention was distracted by the prospect of Bradford Marston's call that afternoon. She had already mentally composed 3 or 4 pretty speeches of rejection and had rejected them all. She was at work on yet another when Maud came into the room with the dignity he affected when he was carrying out an official duty. He bore an envelope on a silver tray. "A message, Mum," he said. "Just arrived from Marston Manor." He bowed out and took a backward step, waiting to see if there was an answer. The envelope was sealed with red sealing wax, embossed with the Marston crest. Inside was a 5-line note scrawled in a hasty hand. "My dear Miss Hartley," it said, "I very much regret that I will not be able to call this afternoon. I have been summoned to London upon extended business and I am unsure when I shall return. Please accept my sincerest apology for any inconvenience that I may have caused you." The note was signed, "Your humble servant, Bradford Marston." Kate's eyebrows went up and her mouth quivered. It wasn't hard to guess what had occasioned the writing of the note. If the situation had been, as she suspected, Bradford had most likely spoken of his call to his mother or father and found them in wholehearted opposition to it, as they should be. He was destined for a society match, and Bishop's Keep was not enough of a bait to attract Lord and Lady Marston. She stood and went to the fireplace to drop Bradford's note into the flames. "There is no reply," she said to Maud. "Very good, Mum," the butler replied, and withdrew from the room. Kate stood for a moment, staring at the flames, licking the note, savouring the relief of knowing that she would not, after all, have to make excuses to Bradford Marston. Briefly she wondered whether losing so advantageous a match ought to make her unhappy. Most women would regret the loss, of course, particularly unmarried women of her age. But she was not most women, and the thought of living singly the rest of her life held no terror for her. She had meant what she said to Eleanor at Melford Hall. She valued her freedom to come and go as she pleased, to defer to no one's opinion, to respect no one's authority but that of her own. Singleness was a gift she would not readily relinquish unless... Kate leaned her head against the mantel as Bradford Marston's note disintegrated into flimsy black ash and fell through the grate. Unless she truly loved the man. She thought of Sir Charles Sheridan and admitted to herself, reluctantly, because it seemed almost traitorous to her independence, that she could love him. Sir Charles was a man of great intelligence and intensity, devoid of guile, one who kept himself to himself, and who did not give himself easily or frivolously. It was that very privateness, that depth and substance, that drew her to him, for in it she felt a call to her own depth. But that privateness was a wall as well, and the person behind it was remote and complex. He had many dimensions, many strengths. The woman whom he loved, if he ever allowed himself to love or be loved, which Kate somehow doubted, would have to be as strong as he to hold her own against him, and as multifaceted as he to hold his interest. Would there not be a constant conflict between two such persons? Would not their relationship be a battle of wills from the very beginning, eventually abrading away the affection that drew them together to begin with? Kate pulled her shawl around her shoulders. The questions were academic, at least as far as she was concerned, for Sir Charles had obviously concluded that she was a meddlesome woman who pushed her way into matters that did not at all concern her. She would not be the one to whom he gave his heart, and against whom he tested his mettle. It was time to stop thinking of such things and return to her typewriter. But when she sat down to her desk, she found herself considering not the fictional murder of the surly gamekeeper in Beryl Bardwell's thriller, but the real one she had been occupied with for the past days, the slaying of Sergeant Arthur Oliver in Highfield's barn. It was a sad death, and she could only feel a great relief that the truth of it had been discovered, and the nonsense about poaching was finally laid to rest. The case could not be solved until the killers had been apprehended or brought to justice, of course, but Edward and Sir Charles would see to that. Far more important was the fact that Agnes's pension was now secure, and she and Betsy could be assured of a comfortable life. Beryl Bardwell turned to the typewriter and rolled in a fresh sheet of paper. Across the top of the page, in capital letters, she typed the words, "Grain thieves in the barn." It was a time to begin a new chapter. While Kate and Bill Bardwell were wrestling with the marriage proposals and murders, Beatrix was in the kitchen toasting her toes before the fire. It was a rare privilege for her, and one she greatly treasured. At home at Bolton Gardens she was never allowed in the kitchen for fear of antagonizing cook who ruled below stairs with an iron fist and whose kitchen was sacrosanct. Miss Pratt had, to be sure, a quite similar demeanour, but she also had a strong affection for Kate. This affection was extended to Beatrice in the form of an invitation to visit the kitchen whenever she liked. To Beatrice, the kitchen at Bishop's Keep was exactly what a kitchen should be. Every morning since her arrival, Beatrice had taken her sketch-pad and pencils and gone to sit beside the fire to watch Mrs. Pratt and Harriet, the sweet little scullery, go about their homely work, washing up the breakfast dishes, preparing the luncheon soup, rolling out dough for a sweet tart, and readying the evening joint for an afternoon in the oven. While they worked, she sketched the cave-like fireplace hung with iron pots and copper-bottomed kettles, the red and green braided rugs on the stone floor, the cupboards filled with neat rows of jam pots, mustard jars, and, topping the whole delightful display, a rose-sprigged china biscuit barrel. While she sketched, Beatrix soaked up as much of the cosy warmth as she could, and thought wistfully of the kitchen she coveted in her very own small cottage somewhere in the north, perhaps near Surrey, where she had gone several times with her father. Not a cottage to share with a husband or child, but a cottage of her own where she could keep her animals and study fungi and write little books and have tea whenever she pleased. But to break away from her parents and obtain the cottage, Beatrix knew that she must have an independent source of income. She had hoped that perhaps her botanical work, particularly her paper on the spore germination of the Agaricenia, might open the door to recognition in the world and to freedom. Besides, it was a subject in which she was passionately interested, and which she had studied so deeply that she knew more about it than any botanist in England. But her work looked to be going nowhere, even with the help of Uncle Henry Roscoe and Sir Charles. There was too much opposition from the scientists, and not even valid opposition at that. It was not the merit of her research that they seemed to find wanting, but the merit of her person, her sex. Even Uncle Harry said so, and angrily too, for he was offended at their cavalier attitude toward her paper. At any rate, she was forced to conclude that botany was not to be the career that would set her free. But the stories. She bent her head over her sketch with renewed energy. If only her stories could earn money, as did Kate's. She was still amazed when she thought of Kate's writing enterprise. It was no secret that women actually earned money by writing, but she had never known one who did, and the thought of it gave her courage and a renewed determination. For some time she had been thinking of a story about a cat called Tabitha Twitchit. Miss Pratt's stove, polished to a jetty brilliance that must have required pounds of blacklead, would perfectly illustrate one of the scenes in Tabitha's story. Miss Pratt herself was humming over her pasteboard and rolling pin at the table. Harriet was peeling a pot of potatoes in the stone sink, and the kettle was whistling merrily on the back of the stove. There was a sharp rapping at the back door. Beatrix looked up. "'Tis old Willie Hogglestock, the pedlar," Miss Pratt said, not pausing in her attention to the tart. "Tell him I'll be out in a shake, Harriet." Beatrix followed Mrs. Pratt and Harriet out into the flogged dooryard under a leaden sky that threatened with rain. Old Willie Hogglestock was a man of nearly 60. with a white beard and a lank figure covered neck to knees in a white apron. His cart was laden with quite an amazing stock of fruit and fish, lovely rich grapes and pears and peaches and oranges, and fish in mother-of-pearl colours and queer shapes, John Dories and Yarmouth bloaters and cod and haddock and live eels and tomatoes. Beatrix enjoyed tomatoes, both the scarlet and the yellow, and they often had them at Bolton Gardens. But Mrs. Pratt scorned them. Tomatoes, she called them, proper rubbish, and wouldn't have any. There was a lovely basket of field mushrooms too, but she turned those down quite as sharply. Miss Pratt completed her purchase of cod and grapes and gave old Willie a smile with his shillings. "You sit for a cup, will you?" "I'll have the cup, thank ye," the old man said, "but not to sit." He looked up at the sky. "Got to be on the manor afore the rain begins, I earnest." He went with them into the kitchen, where he leaned his lank self against the wall and accepted a cup of tea. "You've heard of the news, I reckon," he said. "What news?" Miss Pratt asked, picking up her rolling pin. "We've had no news from the village yet this morning, only a messenger from the manor." Beatrix went to her sketching with a secret smile. The messenger from the manor had made a stop in the kitchen, and now all the servants knew that Mr. Marston would not be calling today. Beatrix, to whom Kate had confided her thoughts about the call, was pleased at this outcome. Whether Mr. Marston had lost his enthusiasm for the match, or his parents had voiced an opposing opinion as to its suitability, or Sir Charles had somehow acted to stop him, she did not know. But however it had come about, one of Kate's suitors had departed the field, leaving only Constable Lakin standing between Sir Charles and Kate. And while the affections of the constable were certainly to be respected, Beatrix knew that Kate's heart leaned toward Sir Charles, as did his toward hers. The only problem she now faced was getting the two of them to recognize the truth. Old Willie had been staring mournfully into his teacup. "That's the sad news," he said, "from Gallows Green. Poor Agnes Oliver is beside herself worrying," he sighed. "As well she might do." "Agnes Oliver?" Beatrix exclaimed, looking up. "Why?" "Why? Because little Betsy's gone missing," old Willie said. "That's why." "Betsy!" Beatrix and Miss Pratt exclaimed in unison. Harriet dropped the potato on the floor, and it rolled under the stone sink. "Aye," old Willie said sadly. "A second tragedy fallen on the same woman in a short time. What's the poor thing to do? I'm sure I don't know." If the old man knew other details, Beatrix did not wait to hear them. She spilled her sketching materials on the hearth and flew to the door. Where was Betsy? And poor Agnes? What was she feeling? She and Kate must go to Gallows Green straight away. Dedham Gaol was only a mile or so from Highfields Farm, but Edward was officially off the case, and Charles knew it wouldn't do to haul James Napthon there. The nearest gaol was in Manningtree, and since P.C. Bradley was heading the investigation, that was the logical place to incarcerate the man. Edward tied Napthon's hands, and they loaded him into the fly. They made the 5-mile trip to Manningtree without event, save for a drenching. The rain was beginning to come down rather hard, and Charles wished earnestly for his mackintosh. "James who?" Bradley asked, looking from one to the other as the three of them dripped puddles onto the floor. In front of him on the desk were the greasy remnants of an early luncheon, a parcel of fried fish, a slice of heavily buttered bread, and a single baked potato, which had no doubt been sent down from the pub on the high street. He cast about for some on which to wipe his hands, and failing to find it, wiped them on his trousers, and then looked guilty as if he wished he had not. He stood up and then hastily buttoned his uniform coat. "James Napthon," Edward repeated patiently, "of Highfields Farm. Oliver's murder took place in this barn." He coughed. Charles could see that the stove was not drawing properly. The air was smoky, and every now and then a blue cloud puffed out around the door. "It was a grain-stealing ring, you see," Charles said, feeling some sympathy for Bradley. The P.C. had buttoned his coat crookedly, and it gave him the look of a boy who had been caught out by the upper form. Sergeant Oliver got onto it and was surprised while taking samples. They shut him in the barn and loaded him onto a wagon and dumped him in McGregor's garden. Bradley pushed his blonde hair back with his fingers, leaving a trace of oily grease across his forehead. His toilet completed, he became more confident. Oliver was poaching, he said. I collected the evidence myself, 2 hares and a net. There's the note too, of course. No, Edward said crisply. The grain thieves wanted you to believe that Archie was poaching, to keep you from nosing around and stumbling on the truth. They planted the hares in the net and wrote you the note. Bradley blinked his pale grey eyes several times very fast. But I don't understand how you know that. You will, Charles assured him, when you see the evidence. But believe it, Edward snapped in a tone Charles had never heard him use. Question him. He jerked his head at Napton. He'll tell you. Bradley blinked again. A momentary confusion flashed into his eyes, followed by a tightening of the mouth that registered an almost imperceptible anxiety. Charles frowned. Was something going on here that he and Edward had overlooked? Bradley recovered himself and looked at Napton, standing with his hands tied behind him, head hanging, the picture of dejection. Who else was involved beside this man? Russell Todd and Tommy Brock, Edward said. Todd's a bailiff who assembles the harvest crews and sends them round to all the farms. Brock's one of his hired men. Napton gave us the names, but they were already under suspicion. Another witness saw them moving grain from the barn to a barge on the river and will give corroborating testimony. Bradley cleared his throat. A corroborating witness. His young voice was thin. Who? Edward jerked his head toward Napton with a cautioning gesture. Later, he said, out of his hearing. Bradley nodded reluctantly. Charles wondered what his reaction would be if he knew that the corroborating witness was a child, a girl at that. But it wasn't necessary to reveal Betsy Oliver's name at the moment, or her role in all of this. Perhaps not at all if Todd and Brock were apprehended and made to confess. Bradley seemed to recollect himself. He straightened his shoulders and reached for a large metal key hanging on the wall behind him. Come on, you, he said to Napton, with unnecessary roughness. I'm locking you up. The act of propelling Napton into the cell and locking the heavy oaken door, without either untying the prisoner's hands or removing his rain-soaked coat, seemed to return to Bradley some of his self-importance. When he came back to the desk, he hung up the key with a flourish, sat down and shoved the parcel of fried fish to one side. I'll need a written statement of everything you know, he said to Edward, taking a printed form out of a drawer. Make it complete. I'll go to Colchester with Napton. Colchester? Edward asked, surprised. You're taking him there? Bradley busied himself with papers. Yes, well, I'm not in charge, you know. It's Chief Constable Pell's case. He asked for it. I'm sure he'll want to question the suspect. Charles regarded the young constable thoughtfully. So Pell himself had asked to take the case. It hadn't been a whim of Hacking's or some sort of punishment for Ned. But why had he wanted it? What was it to him? Edward sat down and took up the pen Bradley handed him. You can have your statement, he said sourly. But before you go trotting Napton off to see Pell, don't you think you'd better collar Todd and Brock? We brought the prisoner here in a fly. On the way we passed a dozen people and a dozen more stores in the high street. Not to put a too fine point to it, but word of his arrest won't take an hour to reach the other two and any others who might be involved. Bradley chewed his lips nervously. Yes, I see the difficulty. Are you available to help? It's a matter of for more than just one officer, I should think. And this case isn't the only problem I have on my hands. It's been a busy morning. It has? Charles asked, looking around. The constable's office didn't appear busy. The launch testified to at least a quarter of an hour of leisure. What's happened? Bradley shifted. I don't suppose there's anything I can do about it, but at least not at the moment. I'll have to institute a search if she doesn't turn up. It's a missing girl over at Gallows Green. He glanced at Edward. You were a friend of Sergeant Oliver's, weren't you? Did you know his daughter Betsy? Edward's face went white. He stood up abruptly, and his chair fell over with a clatter. Are you telling me that Betsy Oliver? Afraid so, Bradley said ruefully. Gone missing. Happened last night, apparently. Sounds a bit improbable, I admit, but it seems she was in the habit of slipping out the window and down the drain pipe after dark. Her mother's in a bit of a panic and sent over to ask for help. Gone missing, Edward roared, and you sit here stuffing yourself with fried fish. He ran to the door and yanked it open. Come on, Charlie. But the report, Bradley exclaimed. He snatched up the paper Edward had been writing on and waved it frantically like a white flag. I can't take this man to Colchester without your written statement. I don't know any of the details. Damn the bloody details, Edward snapped, his eyes flashing with anger. Come on, Charlie. Agnes will be beside herself. I must be with her. And there, in Edward's anguished face, was written the truth that Charles had not grasped until now. It was not Miss Ardley that Edward cared for. It was Agnes Oliver. But Charles was not conscious of any relief, for his belly had twisted with cold fear for the child's safety. Betsy Oliver was a witness to the theft that had motivated her father's slaying, and now she had disappeared. Had the thieves who killed the father taken the daughter as well? Charles held up his hand. "Wait," he said. "We have a man here who may know something. Napthon." Edward whirled. "Of course," he cried, snatching the key of the wall and running to Napthon's cell. But whether Napthon knew something, or would not reveal it, or whether he knew nothing at all and could only deny, they could not tell. After 10 minutes of fruitless questioning, Napthon was flung into his cell once more, and Edward and Charles hastened to Gallows Green.